Warning, the following public space travel podcast episode is a critical discourse analysis of the manifesto written by the shooter who committed the New Zealand massacre on the 15th of March, 2019. As such, this episode contains material that some may find disturbing and triggering. We have chosen to intentionally refrain from using the shooter's name. Public space travel stands unwaveringly against hate, bigotry, and oppression in all its forms. May this episode help comrades and allies better understand the twisted ideas and sick justifications inside the minds of the alt-right. We hope this episode will agitate and inoculate the left and their allies from these abhorrent alt-right beliefs. Now, more than ever, do we need to organize in solidarity against all oppression. We cannot delay. This episode is dedicated to the 50 people who were shot dead and 48 injured in the attack targeting Muslims at two mosques during Friday prayers at Christchurch, New Zealand. A few of these victims, according to Democracy Now!, had included 50-year-old Naeem Rashid was killed at the Al-Noor Mosque after he tried to grab the shooter's gun. Rashid was a teacher from Pakistan who had been planning his son's spring wedding. His son, Talha, was killed alongside his father. Pakistan's Prime Minister announced Rashid would be presented with a national award for his bravery. New Zealand football goalkeeper 33-year-old Ada Alyan, who was just become a father, was also among the 50 victims. So were 14-year-old Saeed Milni, 44-year-old Hasna Ahmed, and father of two, Lilik Abdul Hamid. Rest in power.
I began the meeting by making this statement, which I think needs to be made to the nation.
Public space travel. Public space travel.
And so on and so on.
I can't help but believe that in the future we'll see throughout the world an increasing trend toward the next logical step. We'll achieve full communism.
Public space travel. Public space travel.
And so on and so on.
Welcome to Public Space Travel, a podcast dedicated to social, political critique, comedy, and education. Coming from an anti-hierarchy and anti-oppression perspective, we aim for progressive, radical left solidarity with our brothers, sisters, trans, and non-binary folks of all stripes. I'm your host, Lazarus, and with me today are co-hosts Lucy and Marks. Our special guest, Johnny Lupinacci, an eco-critical scholar and professor of cultural studies and social thought and education. Today's episode is a bit more serious than our usual. We're doing a critical discourse analysis of some of the themes of the New Zealand Shooters Manifesto, which has been highly praised and circulated among alt-right groups online, even though the possession and distribution of the manifesto is now illegal in New Zealand. We will begin with some historical context leading up to the Christchurch tragedy, and a brief discussion on the online spaces in which hate and bigotry is learned, followed by some various themes. One of the main themes we'll consider today is eco-fascism, which the shooter had self-identified as. As always, you can reach us at publicspacetravel@gmail.com, or you can leave us a message on our voicemail at 208-502-1406. So the rise of hate groups and far-right terrorist attacks has been on the rise. In the U.S. alone, according to the most recent Southern Poverty Law Center's intelligence report of spring 2019, it's estimated that, quote, in 2018, there's a nearly 6% of America's approximately 198 million non-Latino white people, that's approximately 12 million people, that have beliefs consistent with the racist alt-right worldview, meaning that they broadly believe that politics should promote white interests above those of other racial groups, unquote. This report also presents a map listing 1,020 active hate groups in the U.S. currently, which is up from 954 in 2018. The website also has a very detailed timeline of United States far-right violence from 1995 onwards. This far-right violence is not a new thing for the U.S. Since we have this deep history of the KKK, neo-Nazi, and white supremacist movements. We are a nation built on the exploitation of non-white labor and slavery, as well as the violent stealing of land from indigenous people under the guise of some manifest destiny BS. So this report goes on to say that, it's not just an American problem. It's right-wing populism fueled by anti-immigrant fervor. And it's exploding across the world with extremist candidates gaining or in power in countries such as Hungary, Poland, Austria, Italy, and Brazil. Research conducted by The Guardian in partnership with more than 30 political scientists showed that 1 in 4 Europeans now vote for populist parties. But in regards to the Christchurch massacre, to bring it back in, the shooter was a 28-year-old Australian citizen and admitted to planning the attack for about 2 years. During this time, he had written a manifesto titled The Great Replacement, which is essentially a reference to the conspiracy theory, a nationalist right-wing conspiracy theory which had stated that white Catholic French population and white Christian European population at large is being progressively replaced with non-European people, specifically Arab, Berber, Middle Eastern, North African, and sub-Saharan African populations through mass migration and democratic growth. Hence, it's really, a dog whistle here for white supremacist conspiracy theory, that of white genocide. In addition, it's also the title, The Great Replacement, is also a reference to the book by Renan Camus, who is an ardent supporter of Marine Le Pen, which is the French politician, daughter of the other Le Pen politician for National Front, a right-wing populist party. It seems to also be a nod to a YouTube video done by Canadian alt-right figure Lawrence Southern, who had posted a video with the same name in July of 2017 that received 250,000 views that year. So this is a big deal. It's really gaining traction among the alt-right, and it's reverberating from there. Today, though, we want to really focus on kind of what the manifesto speaks to about eco-fascism and really give light to what that is, and also help to really break down the abhorrent views of eco-fascism and what that means. Specifically for us on the left, this is something we'll have to combat and deal with today and also the near future. So for those who aren't familiar with eco-fascism, Johnny, did you want to talk briefly about what eco-fascism is, or do you want me to go ahead and just the history? Or
I mean, I guess I can just maybe say like a working kind of generalizing definition of it, and then you can go into it and provide a little more context for it, because I think especially in relationship to this podcast right now, like the way that it's taken up as sort of a springboard for what will really say, I think, is a deeper urge and drive to sort of fill a void with a void, for lack of better terms here. It's like an insatiable urge to dominate and control that I think the people who are prone to eco-fascism, or any kind of fascism, find an affinity towards it in. But in general, it's been this idea, like, to encapsulate it, is just that fascism is necessary in order to preserve humanity on the planet. It's sort of like the simplest definition of it is that human beings are incapable in freedom model of living on the planet, and have destroyed the planet to the point of which requires aggressive, militant, fascist sort of governance of it. And so then we look at that really in connection, in this case, in connection with the Great Replacement. And I'll put some square quotes around that, like the Great Replacement, because it often does get extended to, like if you're following me thus far, like, because a particular group of humans, i.e. mostly those enacting this, will say like white Western industrial males being some of the worst perpetrators of that relationship with the planet and the resources. If you're following me in this logic of like that's problematic on the planet, and most of us who learned either from deep ecology or other aspects of things are like, yeah, sounds good. Like this is really a problem. How the ecological crisis is actually a cultural crisis. And now we're following along, and you're sort of amassing attention. Then what the ideologue, or like the dictatorship kind of affinity likes to really neatly dovetail in is, so if you're following me, cool, and now you're with me and you're kind of gaining momentum, you're vibing, right? Yeah, cool, I'm on that page. Like particular group of humans really needs to think differently about their relationship to the land. Okay, yeah, well, cool, well, they're not fucking doing it, so we're going to really need somebody in charge to make it a rule, because we need rules for people to follow that make sure no one's going to, keep destroying the planet. And you know what, in particular, too, we need it to be about population. I'll put another square quotes around that. We also need it to be a way to conveniently, I'll put that quotes around it, maintain the kind of power privilege that we're currently experiencing. So you know what, like white nationalism needs to kind of buddy up with this, because we need, if there's going to be a white future, it's going to be a white future here on the planet. And so there's sometimes what I think eco-fascism is doing at this particular moment is getting people who are really already kind of cued into like that the planet is speaking to us in different ways, whether it's global climate change or, scarce resources in the particular ways populations have grown, that the response to it is on the minds of a lot of young people and a lot of people around the planet. And so through these sort of politically managed, right, and created scarcities, right, then you have people who are really like almost in a fear state or something. And so you start a logic argument in a place that sort of fits. Right, we're seeing this in our own country, right? You're unemployed, you're impoverished, and so you build sort of momentum, and then dovetail in the other piece that for a particular group fits really nicely. And what I mean for a particular group is like the white, patriarchal, heteronormative, like masculinity, male. So the eco-fascism piece, kind of being fascism that's argued as necessary in order to preserve human life on the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It's interesting that you tied in like the necessary component. One of the things that is said in the manifesto is this green nationalism is the only true nationalism. And so like there is this tie of if you want to have fascism, which is, is upheld by them as the answer, the solution to the world's problems, you also have to include the environment, which is a really, I guess, like, I feel like a lot of lefties would be like, whoa, yeah, like, I got to save the environment too. But like, whoa, this fascism is now in like our, environmentalist domain. What the fuck? Like, yeah, I think that it's really just the dog whistle for ethno-nationalism, white supremacy.
And another rationale, like another way, and this is the really good thing, I think abusers, and ultimately we're talking about this, like mass killings, is like an insatiable urge to find pleasure and outside of taking and dominating. And the ultimate dominating is like, it will dominate until there is nothing to dominate. And so like ends in death. And these, like, to get a mobilization to that, there has to be some real effort around proliferating it. And what these groups, especially in these informal learning spaces, like whether it's like, the threads online, or whether it's like on like listening in gaming groups, and like intentional sort of efforts to politically mobilize, have to have logical entry points that fit, that sort of you begin to, like, a little piece of you sort of agrees.
Yes.
And then they sort of like, I'm listening, oh yeah, that's true. I feel that way. Have you experienced, rejection? Have you experienced these things? Of course, like lots of people have. And that's what like the ideologue and the sort of amassing populace of a dictator gets. How can I get as many different radical groups to begin to shape and form an identity of fulfillment in some purpose to my ultimate domination? And and dominators get really good at convincing us that we want abuse, right? And so that's like something that I'm interested in like in a time where it's like very visible and experienced around the planet, that like we have this Anthropocene, or this radical shift in what life on the planet will be like, and and people are aware of that, then like pulling sort of that as yet another way of bringing folks in.
Yeah, it's interesting that there's a lot of people who even now still don't fully grasp like how like susceptible they are to becoming close to something like this, to entering into this fold, by either not recognizing maybe some of their own biases or something like that, or whatever. It's just, and when I have conversations with people like this stuff, like you just kind of notice that like you could easily, if they just met the right person who just knew how to word things in the way that they could, warp their mind and say, oh yeah, I agree with you actually. You make some good points. I'll follow you along this path. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. That's interesting. So like definitely there's a recent report, but even before the report came out, like this was something that's been, kind of known, that there's absolutely a libertarian to alt-right pipeline on YouTube. The Data and Society Research Institute of 2018, they did a report on this, and essentially they're saying that, quote, in many ways, YouTube is built to incentivize the behavior of these political influencers, specifically speaking to like various alt-right and also libertarian-leaning YouTube channel stars, and how because of their interconnectedness, it really results in viewers basically like falling down this alt-right rabbit hole. And YouTube, since, not only are they monetizing it, so the creators themselves can basically do this for a living, YouTube is also profiting from it. So there really isn't like this incentive, I guess you'd say, for YouTube to be like, hey, you should probably stop. In fact, the report goes on to say how the term platform itself has helped YouTube position itself as a neutral utility that helps facilitate free speech, quote, and openness, unquote. The website similarly seeks policies that offers it protection from hosting user-generated content while simultaneously facing minimal liability for what those users say. This report has shown how these attempts at objectivity are being exploited by users who fundamentally reject objectivity as a valid stance, and as a result, platforms like YouTube have an imperative to govern content and behavior for explicit values, such as the rejection of content that promotes white supremacy, regardless of whether it includes slurs. So definitely like a recognition that, I guess you could say, like this informal learning space, the online realm is really, I guess, kind of piloting this. I've actually had an experience while playing Battlefield of somebody was we basically got into an argument, a debate about becoming a neo-Nazi, and somebody was like, just fucking play, like stop texting, whatever, and he's just like, no, if I convert at least one person, like I've done my job for the day. And it was like really fascinating that, this is when you do online gaming or you're on the online, like you will eventually run into this and you'll see it more and more and more.
Yeah, man. It's fascinating to me, like in the simulated act, I'm making an assumption. I'm not like anti-video games or anything. I just haven't had time to play them in forever. I'm like old school, man. Like maybe some fuck with some Mario Kart or something.
Yeah,
it's been a minute. No, that's not true. I had a friend who was into some different game, and he got me kind of like semi-hooked into this like Borderland or something game.
Oh,
It was
yeah.
like this future.
Yeah.
So but I'm thinking sort of on the fly here on this. Like it's interesting that like there is a particular tactic. I'm assuming like there's some shooting or killing, right, in these games.
Yep.
And so like you're collaboratively bonding, right?
Yes,
On a very like primal level, you're collaboratively bonding around like shared enjoyment of killing, although it's simulated, and I'm not gonna like make a really naive connection like because you kill online you kill in real life, but like there's a little bit of like wiring going on and bonding around that, and it sets a temp, so you're, even if you're conscious of it, it's happening. And so that recruitment and that conversation, while like there's a shared relationship around an enjoyment around killing. Now that's not saying like that maps onto your whole life doing that, but it seems like it's like a rife place.
Oh yeah.
Right, to do strong political recruiting.
Yeah, and I think that you made it really clear. You're not suggesting that like violence in video games, leads to violent people, but there is a certain sense of like normalization and desensitization, I'd say, that goes on. And then, yeah, especially if you have like a Nazi who's typing in your team chat, like, bro, you should probably read Mein Kampf. Like, it's kind of a terrible recipe, but it's interesting.
Also, like,
oh yeah, go ahead.
I was just saying, like, early video games that I know of, like fighting battle games are like, it's always like me, the good guy, equals America, the white people, and every single bad guy in those games is always like some terrorist organization from the Middle East or something like that. Yeah. So you just like right from the get-go when you're like a child, like, that's what I remember. It's like that's
even with some of the modern games, it's very much like a American centered imperialist theme to it. It's not too far of a stretch, but a lot of the like Tom Clancy games is so full of just like, even if they don't intend it to be, it's very imperialists, very
like Red Scare, Russia hate,
racial.
Oh yeah,
very racial. Like, so there's like was it Wildlands or something? It was in South America, and then all the Middle Eastern settings as well.
Yeah, that's. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was gonna say that I do remember, playing these games, and you do end up meeting other people, kids. I've played like with kids, obviously, and they will start talking about their life story with me for some reason, and they'd be kind of like, you just get the impression that they're kind of like lonely, maybe misunderstood or whatever. And then those are the same people who are like visiting, the chat boards, the message boards, and those are the ones that are getting targeted, and they're all over that space.
Yeah, I think that they really, and when I mean they, I mean like the alt-right, really capitalizes on youth who feel alienated or going through mental health or like other life problems and capitalizing and providing them a solution. I think that's kind of the appeal of, like, for example, Jordan Peterson, right? The 12 rules to be the ultimate lobster king, whatever that shit is. And so, like, but to reel it back in to the video game point, just real quick, it's interesting, the video of the shooter, which is despicable, it's fucking terrible. It was actually filmed, like, it's very intentionally filmed as a first-person shooter video game. And before he goes into the mosque, he dog whistles and says, "And subscribe to PewDiePie." And it's interesting, there's on some of these online alt-right places, you have like these edits of it. So for one that I've seen, they have one where they basically cut in PewDiePie playing a video game, but the video game is the shooter's video. And so like PewDiePie's laughing when people are getting shot. It's fucking terrible. But it also like exemplifies kind of the attraction to, you know, PewDiePie for, in one sense, and also how video games and first-person shooters come in. But to tie it back to the eco-fascism, there was an article that just came out yesterday by the Washington Examiner titled "Kellyanne Conway Calls New Zealand Shooter an Eco-Terrorist and Rejects His Claim That Trump is a White Identity Symbol." It was on March 15th by Stephen Nelson. Quote, this is Kellyanne Conway commenting here. Quote, "He's wrong. The shooter is an evil, hateful person who is wrong about that point." Conway told reporters about the alleged shooter's reference to Trump in his 74-page manifesto. Conway, speaking on the White House driveway, encouraged people to read the manifesto and, quote, "cover the entire manifesto if you're going to cover a piece of it," unquote. And then goes on further to say, "I would say, though, read the manifesto because it's very chilling to read it," Conway said. It's interesting how, in one sense, it's like, you know, no, he's not eco-fascist. He's not a symbol of white supremacy. He's none of that. Instead, and you should read it, the shooter is an eco-terrorist, which is, I mean, for me, it reads as if like conflating the left environmentalist with eco-terrorist, and then this shooter to kind of, you know, wrap it all together in this like really hateful like image, which the manifesto itself, the shooter never refers to himself as an eco-terrorist. He refers to himself explicitly as an eco-fascist. I just think that it's really terrible that Kellyanne Conway is telling people to go read the manifesto.
No, don't read this thing.
Yeah.
Don't. Oh, this is really bad. Don't look at this. It's like,
Yeah. Oh no.
like what is it like? Like when something's off limits, it's more enticing.
Oh yeah. It's so taboo. Don't look at it. Don't do it.
Like, oh, it's chilling. Don't.
This has nothing to do with Trump. Ooh, look what I dropped on the floor. What if you read this?
Yeah, that's it. I mean, it's what's really chilling is it's how transparent when you look up the big picture of this, how it's pedagogical in terms of how to learn to do this stuff. Not that we should bury and censor things, but it's hard to say it's not intentional if it's not learned. It's just also sort of like a survivalist behavior of how do you push forward a particular agenda really politically. And amass enough people as possible, and it's gaslighting, it's smoke screening, it's abuse characteristic. You know, I was thinking through when we had talked about this and thinking about it before, and like there's certain rules to this, and I was looking at the manifesto, man, not to read it really, but then you kind of have to look at it, and there's a big image on the front of it. I mean, you've seen that big wheel, with that Nazi sun in the middle, and it reminded me of like this is how ultimately the insatiable urge to take in any human, the dictatorship model, the despot, you know, works to politically mobilize into fascism. I mean, it's fucking everything and not. There's a void, we're going to fill a void with a void. And that makes everybody who's listening still really vulnerable to like, ooh, maybe I'm going to fill that void with something that's not a void, but every time it's just going to be a void. I mean, it says like, workers' rights, anti-imperialism, environmentalism, responsible markets, right? And so it's like anywhere you begin to identify, the game is going to be to convince you that you are in.
Yes,
you're always part of this. It's like rule number 1, like this is the answer. Rule number 2, there's no limit to the answer, and thou shalt have no other limitless experiences except for the answer, and the answer is universally good, right? And so rule number 3, this is the way it is, despite how it is experienced. It's the answer, and it's good. And rule number 4, guess what? You're defined by this. You're living it, and you exist by the answer. Whatever, like fill in literally wherever I say the answer, whatever you build like whatever your platform is, whether it's like environment or hatred or like white nationalism, like you're defined by this, all right? And it's how you do everything, right? And it taps into like it's how you experience, it's who you experience, it's what you experience. That's sort of the rule. It's everything, right? And then we're calling back to those previous 3 rules. There are no limits to it, and you can't exist outside of it. In fact, like it's about convincing folks like, don't look at it, but you have to look at it because there's no escaping it. And then there's actually really one rule that we never really get to, but that's sort of like at the end of like when there's a big thing, as that all of this exists insofar as it allows for the violation of others. Right. So like all the previous rules are in place just so I can enact the kind of domination that my insatiable urge to dominate others. So it's all set up to violate that. And to me, these mass shootings, like they're showing us this. Like there's all this rationalizing insofar as that I can ultimately take. I see it. I'm like, of course, there's a piece. Like, how do you get to claim all these parts on a wheel, except to build an argument that helps you justify and rationalize ultimately getting enough support around there's no escaping it, right? Kind of like, I mean, I listened to you all do your podcast on ideology, and you really kind of talked through that way. It's how does the ideologue get the most out of what they want, ultimately rationalization to violate until there is nothing left to violate.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting that you can like connect that with this notion of like environmentalism. But furthermore, to kind of go with what your point, like on that wheel, they have a couple points where it's like, I think the most majority of people would say like, yeah, environmentalism is really important for like everybody's future. And it's like, okay, cool. We got the door open a little bit more. And like, they keep putting these points out, like no imperialism. Cool. Okay. And then you're right. It just kind of like, okay, cool. Now go to the next step. And it finally, when you just look yourself in the mirror, you've got a Nazi armband on, like,
right. Yeah.
Or not, because I mean, and that's a piece back to education, right? It's like, or not because you learned like absolutely there is no way to rationalize a Nazi. And you know, this the same thing I think we get to is like there's no sympathy for the violent, really, in this case, shooter or you know, or the racist. Like there's no like, well, they're sort of racist because they can be taught otherwise. It's like at this point, which kind of brings me into this idea is like I think these are also reminders that we're like in denial that we're in a war. It's a war against black and brown bodies, and it's state supported.
Yes.
Right. And so another way to gaslight that is to do this sort of like, what's her name, Conway, you know, saying like, read this, read that, like look at these other things, and to say like this is not a state-sanctioned war. It's not particular forms of actual fascism. It's terrorist fascism. It's always the trick then is always to push it out to the far right or left when it's actually being heavily normalized in everyday life as not a war, as you know, not, and I'm putting quotes, not a war. Right.
The body, I don't even know, what does the body count have to get to for it to be considered a war?
Whose bodies? That's really,
and whose bodies?
Yes, exactly. That's, I always think of that when I hear like tariffs or economic sanctions on other countries. Like, you know, and like say like economic sanctions in Venezuela, it's like who's going to suffer the most from this? The poorest are going to affect that, and that's economic violence. Like when we have to call it for what it is, you know. To kind of go into this eco-fascism theme a bit more, I just want to briefly go over like the history of it. It kind of originates, I guess you said, kind of the founding fathers of eco-fascism. It kind of originates from late 18th century, early 19th century. Madison Grant, he was an American. He was like directly personally responsible for basically kidnapping and putting on display a member of the Mbuti tribe of the Congo, Ota Benga. Basically, he was sold by slave traders for display in America. He was caging them in the zoo to live with the apes in 1906 and forcing Ota to perform for the public as evidence of the truth of then fashionable racial science. He also went on and was advocated for his post, the culling of the unfit from the human population, and mapped out a 100-year plan for the perfect human race, essentially killing off group after group until racial purity had been obtained, you know, eugenics. You got another one who's Argentinian-born, Richard Walter Darr. Basically, he was the ideologue for the Nazis behind Blood and Soil, which is basically race and land. It's returning to this romanticized Nordic agrarian countryside image. rather than the urban swamp, which is really just a dog whistle for anti-Semitism, because that's, who's the successful, basically minorities and Jews are the ones that live in the city. So we got to get away from that. So it's the dog whistle for that. This dude was fucking like SS. It was like prison later and died in prison. But also connected with this, and I think I'm seeing the connections here, and specifically about eco-fascism, this notion of the Lebensraum, the living space for Nazi Germany, that they wanted to basically push non-Aryans, non-Germans out of most of the continent of Europe so that they had living space. And of course, this is to displace, murder, starve, remove the indigenous. And I think this is kind of what's being, not kind of, but is being pushed explicitly by ethno-nationalists. They need their living space, and basically minorities, non-whites, need to make room so that we can actually prosper, so they would claim. Just going on further throughout history of the Unabomber, who was basically against the industrial society, which again is back to that blood and soil, like returning to the dog whistle for anti-Semitism. And then I think this kind of steps more into your area, the eco part. You have two basically deep ecologists, Finnish Pentti Lekola and also Savici Devi, who's also the latter is specifically influenced modern alt-right eco-fascists. Both of them essentially embracing the environmentalism, but of course, as come discussed, for selected people, and it's always the white people that should benefit from this. Lekola specifically was responsible for one of the starkest presentations of so-called, quote, lifeboat ethics, this idea of ongoing environmental collapse, and that some people should simply be allowed to die. Very Malthusian thing. But in your studies and research and so forth, what do you think about the kind of this ongoing, or I was saying this increasing trend of like eco-fascism in comparison and contrast with the left's environmentalism?
Yeah, I think it works well to tie in as a rationalizing point and organizing more people into white supremacy, or to more like people who are benefiting by white supremacy, so white folks. And that's me talking about it more in like North American terms. Around the world, I think like we're seeing it in xenophobia and anti-immigrant sentiments, like that there is a very real concern over what's life going to be like on the planet in the next century. And so there's a vulnerability of people, and one organizing principle of like particular groups, like white nationalists or Third Reich or white supremacists or alt-right, whatever we want to kind of call them, is to utilize that in order to put forward their agenda. And so white supremacy is the agenda, or like the original people of the Nordic, and their region. Or I was just reading about a place in South Africa that's like pro-apartheid. It's like this little city, Orania or something. I'm really need to learn more about this, but like they're predicated on like that there is actually, and to tie back to this kind of thing, this sort of great replacement or something going on. Like they're trying to claim genocide on white folks, or maybe not Orania is, but around the world, these rights to organize in these spaces. And so then it sort of reclaims the argument and frames it already in, and sort of obscures the white nationalist piece and says, but it's about the planet, but it's about the environment, and we have a problem. Look, global warming, you're the one who you all been saying, the IPCC report comes out and science is really important, so we're following science. And now so what we know about even the ideologue historical stuff that you shared, and that's another thing I think is really important in the rise of eco-fascism, is the ahistorical nature of political movements. So like when activists have and I'm not mapping this on all activists, but when social movements have sort of an ahistorical approach, or they don't have like strong mentoring and historical knowledge of like how the Third Reich utilized even some radical organizing principles really well, right? And so then they don't necessarily see the tendencies, because privilege is really blinding. Like eco groups could be really white, and often are, and because they start to amass these groups without checking historically how that's worked, and get really far down into a rabbit hole, and then coupled in. And the ideologue is brilliant at this. That's why they end up being noted historically as ideologues to social movements and things is that they fit so many different causes really well, right? And like, I don't want to say it's like a hot cause right now, but it's like an imminent one that governments are trying to grapple with, and that politicians are able to really use in particular ways to build mass amounts of people. And white nationalist movements, I think, are on the rise because of it, because they're saying fundamentally, like, quote unquote, I'm not racist, or I'm not xenophobic, or I'm not anti-Islamic, but we can't have people we can't let everybody into our country. We can't have all people, and it sort of like obscures. There's this, but it has to be for some people, and I think that's entirely problematic. That's based on, as we like know in these kind of conversations, that's based on a particular industrial capitalist way of living. So it's sort of like this double-edged sword. They want to critique oftentimes what even radicals are critiquing, but then replace it. Again, I'm saying, like, fill a void with a void. Like, replace it with sort of this like illusion of a solution.
Right.
Like, we're going to it's not a cultural crisis. It's like, who's actually participating, and if we just exclude other people, and then the people who have been making the population argument, which I think is incredibly problematic, just to self-identify. Like, there's not too many people on the planet. There's too many people on the planet to live a particular way.
Yes.
That doesn't mean we can't live at peace. It just doesn't. There's too many people on the planet to continue the level of exploitation of one another and of the planet's resources. So if you want to maintain the way of living on the planet, right, then you have to convince people that we have a population problem. And then if you have the population problem and you want to maintain it, you have to say who can and can't participate. And so now the environmentalists is really can find themselves, if they attach themselves to the population problem, they find themselves going down the hole or down the avenue or walking the walk or path of that there's too many people on the planet. And then really quickly they're vulnerable to, or there's a slippery slope to that little voice. Sometimes it's in their own head because of the way they think and the privileges and the way they have an apocalyptic sort of like horniness for destruction, that they're like, hey, I know, Muslims have more kids than anybody else, so they need to be kept in places where it's going to be impossible to live on the planet and thus die. And they don't even see themselves as like advocates or supporters of a kind of genocide. So like human thought upon ecocide is actually political genocide. And it's not, and the best thing an abuser could do is flip it. I mean, have you ever been in like a conversation with a really abusive person? And I'm not devaluing like genocide in any way. This comparison is not one-to-one at all. But when they say like, oh, that's your perspective, or that's your perspective, you're like, hey man, you just fucking stole my stuff. No, that's your perspective. I needed it and I was borrowing. It's like, no, that's fucking stealing. Or some kind of comparison. But like, that's your perspective. So the ideologue also flips it like this, like, that's genocide. No, that's what you're saying. I'm actually experiencing genocide too, because if too many people live here, then and they just gaslight and flip the whole thing back around. And that's how I see this great replacement. It's it's sort of like, oh, it's reverse racism. It's this like current loop where you can just flip it. And now we're vulnerable and still sort of moving forward, and it creates a smokescreen to do the dirty work of like building up fascist governments and getting them the kind of popular affiliations that they need to enact the violences that they ultimately need to enact, what happens to be destruction of the planet. And I mean, I think this might get there. It might be a whole separate podcast, but there's these eco-dominion folks who I think are not far from this eco-fascist thing, and they actually believe. Because wrapped in this, and the deep ecologists lay this out, and then the eco-fascists sort of springboard foundations of deep ecology. So it's like it becomes sort of an entry point. But I think it's a departure from, like, it's unfair to put all deep ecologists in there, although some of them go there, that there's a logic of domination, really, in anthropocentrism, like human supremacy of things. And there's a logic there. That then if you really follow sort of like dominion of the planet, like a Judeo-Christianity sort of like God, man, nature kind of hierarchy, we see at the roots of this sort of Eurocentric or white nationalism, then you start to see people who are beginning to, I think, and maybe they always have, I just haven't seen it called this, but who rationalize this, that the faster they destroy the planet as their rights, like they're bringing forth the coming of Christ. And so like they're just like rapidly increasing and advocating for the destruction of the planet as like bringing us closer to the coming of Christ. And so in hearing that from people, I mean, like that's the kind of logic that
it's
we're
dizzying.
working. Yeah, and so again, the ideologue sees this. It's sort of like the business entrepreneur is like, yo, here's a product that we can commodify and sell to the masses.
Yeah.
Right.
And so I think eco-fascism, as well as, like is mapping onto like calling it terrorism, right? Which certainly mass killings are mass killings, but like environmental work, like advocating for the environment isn't terrorism, but it's rife breeding ground for like using as a rationale to recruit people who ultimately want to take life.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's interesting too that like these groups are like, oh, like because the environment is suffering, we have to be more violent to kind of hold our own. But it's usually like those groups, like those white groups, were the ones who sort of started the whole like fucking of the planet to begin with.
Exactly.
So
that's interesting. In the manifesto, he talks about how like the colonizers are always like to blame, and so basically like the context here is that non-whites are coming and colonizing, right? So that's like the shooter's perspective, the eco-fascist perspective. So he's like, oh, the colonizers are so bad, like we got to repel them. And then like I was reading this and I wrote down like, wait a minute, you fucks, like the white people are the OG colonizers and the real colonizers, like so selective in the history, like going back, like, I'm going to stop here at Aryan European white history, and I'm just going to ignore everything else that happened before. And I don't understand why they do that. And I think it's for them, from what I've read and seen, like it's always like, oh, well, this is where the most amount of knowledge and culture, the high culture, low culture. For them, the high culture is, started here from the whites in Europe. But it's like, God, it's such an ahistorical, like, oppressor interpretation.
There's sort of a parody there of, like, between the religious side and then the, like, white supremacy side of just, it's, it's nature is ours to control, to destroy if we want, in the same way of, like what you said, the ahistorical, it's like, it's the white people's territory,
right.
Like, all of it. And then it's the other people coming in.
But yeah, because they totally believe that like if you believe there's a superior race, then if you're in that logic of that great chain of being, then you're closer to that godlike status.
Yeah.
And so then like nature is further down, and that's why dehumanization works so well to rationalize exploitation, because there's this sort of like human is superior, and then you're faced with the dilemma of like, well, what about other humans? Well, they're not fully human,
right?
And so then you can rationalize that whole chain of things.
Very convenient.
Yeah, right. Convenient for a few. And I think that's another important piece. It's like so obvious, but even in our discussion, like it took us a while to get there in our conversations, like that this great replacement of like this whole agenda of like return, like people need to live where they're like from. I guess that's sort of like part of this whole piece, which like then let's way back. That's like what decolonization has been all about. Like get the fuck off of our land,
right?
And get back. Like it's like wiping out all of like the colonial aspect of the history, and like just starting, which is another form of abuse. Like this is it. This is where like I'm saying I'm from here, and now I'm from here, right? And
yeah, or like, oh, should we go back to Pangea? Or should we go back to when we were amoebas and we were all in the same soup pile? Like, how far back are we supposed to go?
Yeah,
right. And how convenient that it works for you right now, and you're going to pick the places to be, aren't you? Yeah.
And I think that the whole Great Replacement thing is really, it's a like even more so specifically because I think it's tucked in with the Great Replacement. This like idea of like the which is tucked in and necessary, according to them, for eco-fascism, is this like ethno-national state where basically, certain ethnicities live where, they're in their homeland. It's really just like what's not really talked about explicitly from them in a direct sense is that, say, in this theoretical world where all the ethnicities and races, like they live in their respective like areas, they're totally like the white Western superpowers, that already have like a hegemony of power over other countries, they're going to use that to exterminate all the countries that are not white. Like once you get to that stage, then like they're still going to go like the shooter goes on to talk about how like so birth rates are the problem, but then later on it's like but it's not just birth rates. Like in the end, like you're going to have to like eliminate, right? And so like at certain point you're just be like this whole country area needs to be eradicated, or at least like lower their birth rate numbers so they just kind of die off, right? Because that's the whole thing for white genocide is this bogus conspiracy theory that because the white race has low birth rates compared to non-whites, eventually they argue it's like 2040 or something. I don't know. Basically, some really eminent time period is when pure whites are going to like lose their majority status, become minorities, and being a minority is a bad thing. It's interesting, one, that they affirm that when you're a minority, like yeah, there's like so much shit against you, but two, like it's fucking bullshit. And like who the fuck cares? I don't care if the fucking white race dies out. Like my obligation as a allegedly white like male is now to go and have interracial like just to spite them. Like fuck you. But
yeah, I could say too, like as a minority, it's always like this thing where it's like sometimes in the dating world you experience a situation where it's like they're like picking and choosing what parts of your minority are really great and the other parts that are kind of like, oh, maybe keep that part a little bit down. Like maybe
is down like a dog whistling though for white though? Is that
like maybe put some more whiteness on that instead. Like maybe don't bring up so much about all the history. Sometimes.
Yeah. Again, ahistorical, like right, like you were saying, taking us back there. Ahistorical, like how do we get to where we are? And I think that's a lot of the rallying pieces to this is that it's gaining momentum in spaces because there will not be white majority spaces, right? And I think that. I mean, I'll just say flat out. I think that's probably the best fucking thing that can happen. Just because I don't know that I'm not saying like because like if you look like white, then you're ultimately all these things. But it's a lot easier to be all these things and to rationalize them if you are. And so, like thinking through that, and I'm not wishing like for any kind of white. I don't think you can call it a white genocide as much as it's like eradicating whiteness.
Yeah.
Right. Eradicating, like we talk about this in terms of like ending sexism, eradicating like patriarchy from relationships. That doesn't mean like that we want all of us like to like lose our neck and be castrated and not to have any sort of like identity in that. But like just because we are who we are doesn't mean we have to enact patriarchy. And the same thing. I think people unwilling to do that work, like relinquishing privileges of whiteness, it's a little bit easier to like fight instead of address. And so they're taking in, and we're getting the loudest aspects of it. I think it might be even louder to come, but like the scarier, like kind of heavy hand, like the planet is being destroyed because you're not submitting to white power, and like I'm pretty sure the planet was here before white power, and the planet can be here after. Right now, you're just making it so you can take out a bunch of fucking people for your own political purpose. Yeah,
it's like when someone's like they ask you like, I want that food you got there. You're like, no, it's my food. And they're like, all right, well then, and then they hit you in the face and they grab your food. You're like, why'd you do that? And it's like, well, I would have had to if you just would have gave me the food in the first. Like you did this.
Right? Yeah. Yeah, and then you were really sad about it, but they were like, don't worry, man, because you're my homie, you're my friend, and you're like, but you just fucking took my food, but they're like, but we're cool, right? And you're like, no, and then they punch you in the face again, and then you're like, shit, this person's just gonna keep, this is like this cycle. So pretty soon you're just like, hey man, no matter what, I'm gonna give you some of my food because otherwise you're gonna take it, and then it's just it's like constantly framing and claiming the entire space and taking up all of that. I mean, and we're seeing it in patriarchy and white supremacy, and now like in bringing in like environment stuff with it too. And
that kind of reminds me of like that point that I think the shooter was making about wanting to start a civil war, like a race war, like that's one of his things, like because that's reminded me of like this like whole idea of that after a while you experience someone punching you to get your food. You're like, you know what? I'm sick of this. I'm going to carry a gun now.
Yep.
And then the war is just going on like that.
Yeah, and I think I don't know New Zealand well, but I mean, like here, I mean, we're in a war, and it's like the police and the vigilante, and like so it's a state-sanctioned war that we're calling not a war, and then these personal like individual enactments allows for it to be like more like isolated incidents, but then we look at it and like between our prison system and like police militarized state.
Right.
Black and brown bodies and women are being, non-white women, even white women being heavily abused. But I mean, like, there's a war, and we don't necessarily call it that. And I think it might be scary to do so, but I mean, I don't even know how. Like if you call it a war, then it acknowledges that there is probably some value in the fight back.
Interesting.
Maybe that's what would happen if.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I know that a lot of the alt-right, like an online discourse, like culture war is like the way that it's described in that sense. And then I guess tying in with you, Lucy, about this notion of civil war, like, yeah, because of this like imminent threat, supposed imminent threat of non-whites, basically, the call for a civil war and the intention of doing the shooting itself to promote more gun control, specifically hoping for the United States to do so, which will inevitably, quote, like lead to a civil war. Like they're taking the accelerationist approach. They want, and even the shooter even says in the manifesto, like vote against, like, basically vote for the worst and, put your foot like all the way on the gas pedal. Like, and
yeah,
it's really fucking disturbing.
It's alarming because I know that like growing up in Northern California, like there are like militant groups, like militia groups that are more leaning towards white nationalism and things like that. So like if it really gets to the point where it's like a full-on war or something like that, it's like they're the ones that are most prepared for something like that.
Yeah.
So that makes it even more terrifying.
I wonder how much too, like culture war, like language obscures the kind of war it is. Like it's not like, is that like, I mean, I think about unpacking that, like it sounds so less aggressive. And then when we know it's really violent, it's really like, but it's a culture war. But people are getting like killed for this and disappearing and incarcerated at rates, and like kids on borders and cages and all this stuff. It's like a full on war. And I mean, and it was in Mediterranean, like refugees coming across the ocean are just being by governments, just like boats sunk and things like, I mean, this is this real war.
Yeah. Like people are dying. It's not just like, not just Twitter hashtags.
Yeah, that's what. But it's a culture war. It's like you got movies and we have musics, and like whose music's got bigger markets and are better and that kind of thing. It's not real like bodily war. I mean, it is like you can't separate culture from like the lived experience. So
right.
Yeah, I think this is like what Zizek would say about like symbolic violence, that it's perpetrated through like language, which inherently reinforces truth hegemony, right? And so for them, they're pushing a certain narrative, and in that normalizing kind of way, like over time, like it becomes more and more ingrained and immersed in the culture. I think that's why, like, kind of going back to your point earlier about, was it in South Africa, the apartheid, like Trump had like done like a Twitter post about how he wants to look into white farmers who are basically like losing their land, which it is basically like, it directly is like this kind of connection to white genocide that's being perpetrated down there, which isn't happening, and it's fucking bullshit. Right. But yeah, in regards to this like notion of culture war and so forth, I think that the online like domain, this informal learning setting, I think educators and social justice like oriented people, we need to like address this. I know that there are some, I guess you could say, like YouTube celebrities or just online, public intellectual or basically whatever's online, like ContraPoints, I think does a really great job at addressing in a very entertaining way too, as being one among just a few. But I think that we are kind of lacking in that. And I think one, as you said before, like knowing your history and the roots, like I really like helps show like the true colors of what's being said. And two, like, I don't know, what do you all think about like this like need for more left presence, specifically addressing, whether it be eco-fascism or alt-right, in this, I guess, meme war, culture war. I mean, the shooter himself says, I've learned more on the internet than than I do in real life. That's where that's where truth is. That's what, what he's saying, or he did say. But what do you think about that?
I personally I don't like the idea of like getting involved in memes as a way to fight something.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know, maybe that's just me, but it feels not adequate. It feels like when a child comes up to you and starts calling you names, and they just keep calling you names, and it's like, all right, well, that's just a kid, like, just calling me fat, but like they keep saying it, and I can't tell them they're being mean because they don't care because they're a kid. So I have to tell them. It feels like I had to go down to their level to then engage and be considered worthy opponent or something like that, because I made a good meme with a good good hashtag.
Yeah, I agree. But at the same time, though, like, this is, I guess you can kind of say, the medium for like the millennial and the younger generations, though. Like, the shooter himself had said, while we may use edgy humor and memes in the vanguard stage and to attract a young audience, eventually we will need to show the reality of our own thoughts and more serious intents and wishes for the future, blah, blah, blah. And then goes on later to say, create memes, post memes, spread memes. Memes have done more for the ethno-nationalist movement than any manifesto.
Yeah, it's a recruiting tool, huh? It's a grooming like kind of tactic. It's interesting because it is like it's saying like that image has that much power.
Yeah, I think when you connect it when you connect ideas through comedy, or I would say like humiliation, I think is like a kind of a key thing, especially on YouTube, where they're like destroyed by logic and fact, like those SJWs. Yeah. I think that appeals to a certain emotion. I don't want to say nature, but like an emotion or something that gets people like agitated, shows their superiority. They can laugh it off. But what is it doing? That's like reaffirming. That's just like self-reaffirmation. Like, whew, my ideas are true and other people are getting destroyed. I'm right. Cha-ching.
Yeah, I guess it also goes back to what you were saying, Johnny, earlier about just like that need to want to destroy and dominate.
Yeah, man. Exactly. I want to know that. I ask all this time. It's like people are like want to boil it down to a simple solution, and they say like, well, how do you do that? And one we talked a little earlier, like as much as I think we mobilize and that computers can be a tool, or memes or technologies can be a tool, is that like we have like a materiality to us, and that we have to like walk together or sit together. I mean, walk is kind of ableist, but be in places together that are like multi-species, right? And let our bacterial colonies like interact. There's this really interesting stuff, and I'm just like, I should have pulled it, and like we need a whole like research team to like look this stuff up for us. But I was reading somewhere in some rabbit hole around like these experiments being done around like bacterial, like understanding bacterial colonies in people's guts, right? And like it's in animal experimentation stages, and that's not me now condoning animal experimentation or anything like that, because it's opening another whole can of fuckery. But there's like this science now, and I put some scare quotes around science, but I think this is some interesting stuff that we probably knew before we turned to only science to teach us things, that the particular animals that didn't have the bacteria colonies introduced into their upbringing, so they're like raised in isolation, right? Then, which is torture. So I don't want to condone this. This is really problematic. Yeah. But what I'm getting to, they didn't know how to behave. And then they give certain groups of animals also raised in these for periods in isolation, the bacterial colonies, and they knew how to behave with it. And in a sense, saying like the bacterial colonies have mobilized us and sort of are in communication, and like there's a knowledge in that exchange that's going on. Like we don't know it all up here. All that's to get at like we have to be amongst each other and other things. Like we are communal. Like our histories, our like existences are in community, and I don't want to over romanticize that community or like sound like I'm for some like going back to some ancient way of being, but valuing that, maybe some of that knowledge of that ancient way of being and honoring it. So we ought to be together as well as utilize these tools to sort of infiltrate. But then it kind of gets on that point. I was like, I want to know like what people love, like what are they not like what gets you off, like what are the things that you really really enjoy. And like from a young age, like how do we support, that's back to that like anarchist education, how do we support like an open space where we don't get trained to love individual competition and this notion of like seeing myself as separate from and superior to others, and I only exist and my value is only experience, and so then my joy and my pleasure gets really wrapped up in my understanding of self as separate to and superior to others. So if I'm not getting to dominate a bunch of people, I'm not feeling good about myself. And sometimes it's really hard to articulate, but I wonder like what gets people off, because we have this whole like isolation of like what gets me off is like this humiliation porn, and it's not even like sex as much as it's like just seeing people put down and trolling and all these things. So it's sort of like this thing that's coming up because we're just not cohabitating in ways that allow for people to experience pleasure, not in competition, but in community. And so I just get back to that, like, what is it, like, what is it you love, or what is it you're learning to love, and decoupling it from sex, but not making sex taboo, right? And so it's like, what are the things you enjoy and like make you feel good, and that are not wrapped up in domination? So it's not anything goes, but that aren't harmful to yourself or to other folks. And that's sort of that, like, where I think like anarchists have spoken to this in a number of capacities. But then when we turn to like what ultimately leads to fascism, when we turn to authority and control and dictatorships, when we defer what we love to the state, or to like being told what it is, then we're really vulnerable to being like shaped, and to being foot soldiers of patriarchy, to being foot soldiers. And that's not to take individual responsibility off that, but it's a lot harder to break an addiction to wanting to see people suffer and to getting off on it. And I truly believe, and I don't know that it's like there's a recovery from it, so I'm going to sound really awful, like, but I think there's probably prevention of it. I hope there's some sort of recovery, because like we're all in it. But I think the best is like for future generations, like how do we not allow for it to get this far gone to where we're trying to remediate it?
I had one, so like I've been the person who has been for a long time saying like I don't want kids, I don't want to have kids, whatever. But recently I've been like, I kind of do, because I want them to just be in the fray. Like I want them to annoy people, like get out there. Like I feel like my child will be braver than I am, and just really get in there and mix it up. And that's what we need to do, or something like that. Like that's the only thing I can think of top of my head.
Right. Yeah. Or even if it's not your kids, it's someone's kids. I mean, someone's kids on the planet. Right. I also think there's a real like whiteness, fragility of modernness to this like imminence. It's gotta happen right now. Shit is so fucked. It's I'm so like, it doesn't matter, like do whatever, because things are really messed up. And once you just keep saying that and putting that into the world, it like makes that behavior even more. And I have and we'll keep this anonymous. I have some friends that are not white, not like, oh, I have a not white friend, but like really some indigenous mentors, and they were always so chill. Not like they're okay with it, not that they don't have righteous anger, but they work and they say like, man, part of all these like white environmental writers that are freaking out about the planet haven't survived a genocide. And that's not condoning that it's okay, but like there's a wisdom on this planet of like what's going to be here, and it's going to be, there's going to be people, there's going to be humans, there's going to be a planet. It's going to look a lot different, and we have a chance for it to look a lot different because we could change the way we live on the planet, not kill a whole bunch of people so that you can maintain this way, like not enact genocide in the name of like in the fear that you're going to be a victim of genocide, but really just so that you have to not have an iPod and not have a bunch of like nice shit that's at the expense of other people on the planet. Like we like our shit so much that we want to say that people are trying to enact genocide. By we, now I'm saying like white folk. There are kin. I won't even call them kin. They present as kin, like whiteness, saying I like my shit so much and I like my power so much that I want to say you're enacting genocide on me because you're just asking me to not, or telling me even. Like asking is already like we're past that. Telling me I can't have that stuff, or saying, it could be a different planet if you didn't live this particular way. Yeah. That you want to like wage war back.
I think it's so like ironic, but also like a slap in the face to indigenous for white people to come in and be like, oh God, there's, I've taken this land, whatever. But then now it's like, oh, but now there's white genocide going on. Like that's such a slap in the face to like indigenous and people of color, like to go and fucking do that.
Yeah.
It's like you're just alive and thriving, and that by you thriving, you're committing genocide on me. I don't like it.
Yeah, no, yeah. Fucking terrible.
You're doing well.
What is that? Is that like not? I guess it's definitely victim blaming, or like a very narcissist. Is that the right term I'm thinking here? Or it's basically just like it's like that one. I guess you could say like that one meme from Eric Andre's show where he shoots Hannibal and he's like, "Who killed Hannibal?" Like.
Yeah. And victim blaming would be like the person in a position of power is saying like, well, this bad stuff has to be done to you because you know, you spoke up, or like you started to thrive, and so that's your own fault. If you just known your role and kept in your stayed in your place, like the quintessential like oh, this woman was raped, and then they say like, yeah, but you know, she was out at night. Yeah, you know, like what was she wearing? Like ask for kind of shit. You know, and so remember, like the 5th rule of all those rules of Dove, like it could be the 20th rule. It's the nth rule of a fascist rule, like the ideologues' rules, is there is no rule, and don't talk about the rule because the rules don't exist. So it's like this constant gaslighting of like it's anything and it's everything, but don't talk about it because if we talk about it, then like we're back in the loop of the rules. There are no rules to this.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. It's like quantum theory, like it exists. Like fascism is like quantum philosophy or quantum politics. It exists because it doesn't exist, but then it doesn't exist because it does exist. And if you observe it, it will break apart and not exist again.
And if you resist it, it will kill you.
Yes.
Which feeds into like its whole piece is to like that it requires like the insatiable urge to take and take and take and take and take. And then the best thing I could do if that's my urge, or that's the kind of like culture we built around, if we want to call it a culture war, then the best thing I could do is convince a bunch of people that that's what they need. Mm-hmm. Right? Mm-hmm. It's like, and then if that's it, then it's ultimately rationalized as what we need in order to save the planet, in order to save children, in order to like, so there's like this rationale that you get pulled into the loop of it. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is total bullshit. Like I'm not arguing for it. I mean, but it works. And I'm not like there's a lot of victims who like spend sometimes their entire life, you know, rationalizing the kind of abuse that they're in.
Oh yeah.
I don't want to say that that's okay in any way.
I still go back. It's so dizzying to like engage, and you know, like the idea of like you want to like get in the same space with somebody like that, and you know, like you say, like sit with them and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, you're like, I am so exhausted by you, and
they want that, you know,
I know,
to their benefit.
Yeah. Oh man, and masterful, like the good. Any one of us, as much as we know about this, would be like, wait, maybe I'm totally fucking wrong. I mean, that's the masterful bit. Like a good ideologue, a good like a good really successful person would be like, hey man, you know, I noticed you're vegan. Like, yeah, man, I'm vegan too. Like this, like the really vibing into like the lure into it, and we like serial killers. That's probably one of the best fucking ways to maybe even begin to understand this stuff. Is like serial killers. Like you don't meet them and they're like, man, that was the scariest dude ever. Like you could point to that's the serial killer. You know, it's much more complicated than master manipulation.
Predatory killer cult.
Yeah. Yeah. And successful at being able to like learn and study and think through what a group of people are experiencing and liking and knowing enough to be in it, to build and establish that kind of trust and to do grooming behaviors. It doesn't just like come off as like these like real quick like happenstances, like, oh man, someone played this video game and watched this video and then turned into, you know, a killer. There's a big cultural grooming piece going on here.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's very, very cult-like too, like the whole thing where it's like every good lie, there's a little bit of truth, and you get someone into your little cult that you have going on.
Yeah, I think that's a good way of like describing kind of the ideologue, especially like this fascism, eco-fascism, and so forth. Like, oh yeah, you take care of the environment. There it is. Gotcha. You just need a little bit, an inch, just to get like a mile. Like,
yeah, and then they each sort of form. So like, if you've been thinking about like, well, what could we do to, you know, be more conscious of global climate change? Well, reduce fossil fuels. Okay, great. So like I'm going to look at like reducing fossil fuels and then get involved in some sort of social organizing. It's sort of like almost saying, hey, I'm here and I want to do something. And a good ideologue and like, the rise of fascism says like, here is where you fit into this. And like, not you or me, but you might like people probably find themselves pretty far down and into it. Now, if I'm into that and I absolutely really enjoy, like I get off on like the humiliation or like the ultimate domination of others, then like I get more catalyzed in that and that organization and that group. And I might even learn that that's a way to be, I think this is something probably if we're male identifying in a patriarchal culture, like there's a big lot of like even self-work on how do we engage in relationships, whether they're like hetero or queer or anyway, that aren't wrapped up in the domination of patriarchy.
Right.
It's like constantly the work, man. You're doing the work, right? So, like I'm the same way, but we all know it's like being. I'm not an addict, but I can imagine this is like maybe if you're addicted to alcohol or to narcotics or something, like you're always like we're pretty addicted to the privileges of patriarchy, and so like it's like one little like we're always like we could always be like one bad friend away from being like. I can't even get myself to say it but the language could come so quick. It's like, right, slips in because it's just like right there. Old habits die hard, and I can lucky me, I could genuinely say like being raised in feminist spaces, that like knowledge of that is there. It's not. It doesn't even feel like me when it comes out, but still it comes out so quick. So I can talk to like with some of my friends for whom like they had to like. Learn to undo that even closer that it's like right there. So I wonder if that's similar to these kinds of things. You get off, it's like genuinely luckily don't get off on controlling people, probably to a fault. Like I'm like, man, like it helps me like think through anarchism without as much like pushback.
I wonder what that psychology, what that is, because I'm also thinking about going back to the video games, like realizing that like I feel like there's almost like this spike in the type of video games that really are focused around competition, like Fortnite and games like that, where it's all like those are the most popular games right now, and it's all based around competition and dominating other people and being the best.
But we can dance together in that game in Fortnite, so I don't see your point, Vic.
We could floss together. That's true.
Yeah, but I don't know what Fortnite does, but I mean, there's studies on this. Like, there's like gaming programmers have learned to program in like addicting aspects to games, and so like they've shortened the length of games and made them so like the way you have to play them have an addicting component in them. Like we could say that's a form of capitalism. So we could look at it as a single issue and say, well, that's capitalism. Planned like products like that are planned obsolescence, but for gaming, and they'll like hook you in and get you kind of on it. And some countries have actually said like there's gaming addiction as like an actual like diagnosis. But then I've also wondered like how naive we would be to think like if you're able to program it for like buying it and needing it, and you also couple in that like things that feed into like domination, control, like hyper like identities in multiple ways, even if they're not hyper masculine. Like what comes in with that addiction, what gets coupled in with it, doesn't compound sort of the problem.
Also, interestingly enough, like when you hear a lot about the criticisms about games like this, the developers who work on these games are eerily quiet all over the place, and I find that weird. I find that very strange.
Yeah.
I wonder if they're like in a warehouse with no windows or something.
Pretty close. I mean, pretty close in ways, and that's not to pick on them. Like, I mean, there's more like they're more closed communities, like full service spaces, and then like often described as really amazing places to work because everything you need is right there. So almost like communities themselves.
Yeah.
All right. So that was some really good discussions on the eco-fascism and some of the content that's in that Shooter's Manifesto. Definitely left it open-ended for investigating some of and exploring some of these other themes, specifically about like whiteness, white fragility, and further. We'll have to do some more episodes on that. definitely have some in the works about whiteness and white fragility. But thank you, Johnny Lupinacci, for coming on and talking with us. It was a pleasure having you, our first public space travel guest.
Yeah. Thank you very much.
And yeah, if anybody wants to reach out to us, we're at publicspacetravel@gmail.com. Again, our voicemail is 208-502-1406. Until next time, I'm Lazarus.
And I'm Lucy.
I'm Marks.
And we will see you next time.
Public space travel.
Don't worry, buddy. You're doing fine.
Public space travel.
Yeah.
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 As we're talking about a war of militias, and there's some sort of helicopter flying over one of our spaces.
Oh yeah, there's someone mowing the lawn.
Oh, that's
like,
it.
It's a tank.
I was hoping it didn't pick.
You know?
They're coming for me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Triangulated my position.